So welcome to Policy Exchange. I see plenty of you have been here before. You know the sort of thing we do, and if you don't know me, I'm Blair Gibbs. I'm head of Crime and Justice here at Policy Exchange. This is a quite informal event, really, a discussion, and in some ways a book launch for a book that I don't think has been publicised much in the UK yet, but has been out for some time in the States. It's the book that's on your chair, Daring to Fail. And it's been published by the Centre for Court Innovation in New York. It's a fantastic collection of interviews with dozens of really quite serious figures in the criminal justice world, mostly in North America. And it's frankly no surprise that it came out of the CCI. If you don't know who they are, the Centre for Court Innovation in New York is a think tank, I suppose, but it's also very much a do tank. They do run projects, they do take charge of local criminal justice policies in courts and in probation, and they deliver things on the ground. And if you don't know, the Red Hook Community Court is perhaps one of their most famous innovations, a problem-solving court. It was 2008 when I went to see it. By then it had been up and running for some time. And of course it's a great model that's now being mirrored elsewhere in the world. But we're not here tonight to talk about success. Although Red Hook is a great success, we're here to talk about failure. And Greg Berman, the director of the Centre for Court Innovation, loves failure. He doesn't love to fail, I think he loves studying failure.
I failed my fair share too.
So that's the theme of tonight's discussion: why failure happens, what it teaches us when it does happen, and perhaps why we don't value failure in criminal justice quite enough. I won't say much more other than to just say that there's a lot of doom and gloom at the moment about cuts in criminal justice that we all know plenty about. But I think there's also lots of reasons to be optimistic. There are still lots of local groups doing important work on the ground, which is making a real difference. And I think in crime and justice, success is often very small and very local. Failure, on the other hand, can be very large as well as very small. And we don't talk about it, in my view, enough. So tonight's event is designed to just get us talking about failure. John Perdue from The Economist is going to be asking questions. I won't say much more. They'll speak for about half an hour. Greg will say more about his book, and then it will be open up to everyone to contribute from the floor. So join me in welcoming John and Greg tonight.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Policy Exchange for hosting this. Greatly appreciated. Greg, before we start talking about both books, in fact, it's two, not one, just wanted to talk a little bit more about what the Centre is, because I was surprised when I went to New York a couple of months ago and visited you by the scale of your operation. And your staff seems to be several times the size of The Economist staff to begin with.
And I always describe it as lean and mean.
Right. No, but I mean, well, maybe it's lean and big. You run a lot of programs, and you have, for a British think tank at least, a surprisingly large budget. Can you tell the audience a little bit about how you operate?
So I run an organization, again, called the Centre for Court Innovation that has about a turnover of about $20 million a year, and about 170 staff people. And we really have what I like to think of as a twofold mission. In New York, we're a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization. And in New York, we've forged a unique relationship with the state court system, where essentially they hire us to function as their research and development arm. And in that capacity, we have, over the past 10, 15 years, created, and I lose track of it, but 16 different demonstration projects, each of which is kind of testing a new approach to the delivery of justice. And these range in size and scale from the Red Hook Community Justice Center, which has a little bit of notoriety over here, which is, several million dollar organization that handles 4,000 criminal cases a year, and is trying to re-energize the relationship between the court system and a low-income community in Brooklyn. That's a very kind of complicated, large-scale project. And that's kind of on the high end. And on the smaller side, we run a project called the Brooklyn Mental Health Court, which is working very intensively with 80 defendants each year, linking them to long-term mental health treatment in lieu of incarceration and trying to get better outcomes from that process. And so that's kind of the work we do in New York, is very much focused on demonstration, using demonstration as a way of testing new ideas. But our work has never been kind of confined just to New York. We've always had aspirations to be larger than that, to be national and international, in fact. And what that tends to look like is functioning in some ways, although we're not a for-profit concern, functioning in some ways like a consulting firm and going out and helping the judge in San Francisco that heard about this great project in New York and wants to try something similar, or the prosecutor in Des Moines, or the magistrate in North Liverpool, come up with something similar to what we've done in New York. And so we do a lot of what we call training and technical assistance. And then the last thing we do is perform original research. And the book that you guys are holding in your hands or having your families sit on tonight is a product of this last area of work, which is trying to really make a positive contribution to the national and international conversation about justice.
So let's get on to the books. You've written not one but two books about failure, which seems like rather quixotic and indeed perhaps even depressing thing to do. Why are you so interested in the stuff that goes horribly wrong?
So I feel like I'm making a career out of trumpeting failure. I'm a big advocate of failure. And I think failure is enormously important to look at. Right now, and I know the UK scene less well, but right now in the US there's an enormous emphasis being placed on bringing science back into justice, and evidence-based programs and evidence-based practices. And I think that's all good, and in a way a natural corrective to decades in which policymaking was based on politics or anecdote or just whatever the whim of the moment was. But alongside that has to go the acknowledgement, if you're going to test new ideas, many of them will fail. And in a weird way, I think that we're very good, again, speaking just about the American context, in a weird way, we're very good about talking, Americans are very good right now about talking about their own personal failings, right? My struggle with addiction, my struggle with my weight, my struggle with my spouse. Horrible at talking about professional failings. And that strikes me as a rich area to look at. And I think that there's real consequences when we don't talk in an honest way about failure. And I think there's consequences inside the criminal justice system and consequences among the general public. I think when we don't talk honestly about failure inside the criminal justice system, it creates what we call in the States a CYA atmosphere, cover your ass environment, right? Pardon my French. Where criminal justice officials are incredibly risk averse and don't want to end up on the front page of the New York Post. And so they get very, very conservative, not in a political sense, but in a kind of structural sense. And so I think it has horrible implications for the criminal justice system when we fail to talk about failure. But I think the ramifications are, in some respects, even worse for the general public. Because when we fail to talk honestly about the reality that lots of new ideas fail, we create very, very high expectations for the criminal justice system, right? And it turns out to be enormously hard to change the behavior of offenders. It turns out to be enormously hard to close prisons. It turns out to be enormously hard to change crime-plagued neighborhoods. But we keep setting ourselves up for failure over and over again, which just breeds public cynicism about criminal justice in particular and government kind of writ large when we fail to talk honestly about the reality that lots of things fail.
In the books, one of the things that's most interesting to me is you go through a whole bunch of quite high-profile experiments in different states in America, some of which will be familiar to people in Britain, broken windows stuff in New York, but some of which, like Operation Ceasefire, DARE, HOPE, drug courts in Hawaii, are less familiar. Are there sort of common reasons for failure, or are there, is failure a sort of multi-course or a success?
Well, it's just to back up for a second. I think that I think there's some things that we can say with absolute certainty don't work, right? but very few. There's, the DARE drug education program, Scared Straight programs, boot camp. There's a handful of programs that have been tested rigorously and in multiple studies have been found not to work.
Just quickly, are people familiar enough with these programs to take that? Would you like a little more explanation?
I can circle back to it. And then there's a handful of programs at the other end that have been tested in randomized trials that we can say with some high degree of certainty work. But let's be clear, the vast majority of programs that are undertaken by police, prosecutors, probation, courts, pretrial agencies fall into this gray area in the middle where you kind of have to exercise some judgment to determine whether they work or not. And I think that we're guilty again and again of having this kind of pass-fail approach to social policy, right? Does something work or does something not? Well, the truth is very, very blurry, right? The closer that you look at things, it's harder to discern like what works and what doesn't. To circle around to your question, I think when we survey programs and we look around the country at what works and what's being tested, some themes do emerge among programs that have been less than successful. One of them is this kind of again and again and again, this over-reliance on charismatic leadership. This kind of falling in love with this Svengali figure that's going to fix everything and that they're going to change the world. And then lo and behold, they move on to other projects.
Yes, there's an interesting case of the drug courts in Denver.
Yes,
where
exactly.
It was the case that it was the hugely successful program, but all appeared to hinge on one charismatic judge. And this is not a sustainable model.
So the problem of just because something worked once doesn't mean it's going to work forever and ever. And just because the drug court worked for a discrete period of time in Denver or Minneapolis doesn't mean that it's going to always work in perpetuity. And so this notion that things fall apart is something that we see over and over again. And related to that, as a kind of cause of failure, we see the problem of context. Just because something works in one setting doesn't mean it's going to work in every setting. And related to that is, local politics can destroy a project. One of my favorite singers is Billy Bragg, and he has a line that I like where he says, you can borrow ideas, but you can't borrow situations. And that turns out to be true. Los Angeles is different than Chicago, is different from North Liverpool, is different than Bristol. And just because something works in one place doesn't mean that you can take it off the shelf and it's automatically going to work in all these different places.
So you can take inspiration from a program that is successful, but you're going to have to tweak it and kind of find out how to make it work for yourself.
Exactly.
And just still on failure, what does success look like and what does failure look like? I mean, success is not 100% success ever. It's we're talking sort of incremental improvements at the margin that count as success.
Well, I think that, back to this kind of issue of the criminal justice system setting itself up for failure, I think there's a huge history of criminal justice programs over-promising what they can, in fact, deliver. And the example that I like to cite in the United States is the Second Chance Act, which is this kind of wonderful piece of legislation that was passed at the end of George Bush II's term as president, kind of a rare piece of bipartisan legislation that funds reentry programs for parolees coming back to communities after a stint in prison. It's great, except that embedded in the language of the legislation is the expectation that programs receiving Second Chance Act dollars will achieve a 50% reduction in recidivism. There's no criminological evidence to suggest that when you work with the parolee population, which is an incredibly difficult population to work with, you will achieve anything like that. And so we've embedded failure into the legislation, right? And just while I'm on that point, while I'm on that point, this kind of the line between success and failure is very, very hard to kind of calibrate. And I want to kind of point to one of my own projects as an example of that. So we actually have been the beneficiary of some of the Second Chance Act dollars. And so we run a reentry program in Harlem that's working with parolees for the 6 months after they leave state prison. And these are all parolees coming back to East Harlem, which is a neighborhood in New York that's kind of notorious for crime and has a very high rate of parolees coming back to it. intensive supervision, intensive support links to treatment, while for the 6 months, first 6 months post-parole. So we've studied this program, we've been running it for a little while, and evaluators tracked participants for 3 years post-program. And we found, encouragingly, reductions in reoffending, 19% reduction in recidivism. So not 50%, but 19% is actually, in the criminal justice literature, we start to think about having ticker tape parades thrown for us, right? At the same time that we found that, and our first instinct is, let's declare this a success. At the same time that we found that we had actually doubled the rate of returns to prison when comparing our participants to participants that were just on regular parole, because of what's known as a supervision effect. So we were supervising people more closely. They weren't reoffending, but we were catching them for what's known as technical infractions, right? They missed appointments with their parole officer, they tested dirty on urines, they broke a curfew. And so here was a project that was set up to reduce both crime and incarceration, and had succeeded at half of that and failed at half of that. And so is that a success? Is that a failure? I know how I talk about it to funders, but among friends, like, let's be honest about that. Let's not lie. Let's not effectively lie by omission. It would be very easy for me to come here tonight and only talk about the reduction in recidivism. But the reality is more complicated than that. And until we're honest with that, if we're not honest about that, we cheapen public discourse, I guess would be my argument.
There's a nice quote in Learning from Failure from Joan Peterson at Stanford Law School, where she said that there's nothing in our history of over 100 years of reform that says we know how to reduce recidivism by more than 15 or 20%. And the first time I read that, I thought, God, how terribly depressing. But actually, if you're able to do that, given the number of people in prisons in America, that's an absolutely huge effect.
Well, I think that, A, we haven't been honest about that, and so that's I think people's reaction to that is much like yours. And I've kind of used that quote in other settings. And people's reaction to that tends to be one of kind of shock and horror. And I think it's on us, the people in this room that work in the field of criminal justice, to make that case in a more persuasive way to funders, to elected officials, to the media, that changes in recidivism, changes in crime that look incremental, 10 to 15%, when you follow the dominoes, reduced victimization, changes in improvements in wages, all sorts of benefits that come from seemingly marginal changes like that actually add up to enormous changes on the ground. But we haven't done a very good job of that.
Let's talk a bit about the role of the media in all of this. I mean, people often blame the media for all sorts of evils. In this case, probably justified. Experimenting in criminal justice is made somewhat harder by newspapers and magazines who jump on examples of often programs that are inspired by academics or people with kind of liberal political sentiments that go wrong. And you know, if you have a high-profile disaster, parole, killing somebody or something awful like that, then a program that might hitherto have been fairly successful can get shut down very quickly. So what have you learned from talking to all the people you've talked to about how to deal with that sort of whirlwind when it comes?
Well, I think you have to build up credibility before the inevitable bad thing happens. I mean, I think it's very hard to play defense when something bad happens. And I think the media is part of the equation that we have to factor in. The media is part of the problem here. And the old cliche of if it bleeds, it leads, I think still, you know, pertains to many, many media outlets that I know, particularly in New York. And I think that the media also has this other role, I don't know how you think about it, but the coin of the realm in this world, when you work in government, when you work in public interest work, the coin of the realm is public attention. And so in a weird way, media are the scorekeepers, who's up and who's down. And I don't think media tends to be reflective about that role that they play, in fact. And the media can do enormous disservice to innovative efforts by giving credit to the wrong people, for example. We see that happen over and over again. And again, this gets back to the dangers of charismatic leadership. There's this kind of tendency to give credit to the wrong people.
This is a problem with Operation Ceasefire, right?
This certainly
magazine, which is a terrible publication, and if you've ever read it, ran a cover where they pinpointed that they held up one guy as the reason why this program had been successful, and that led to a great deal of sort of creative infighting.
Yes, so we see that happen over and over again. And I think the other thing that I would say about the media, and I would not separate elected officials from this, is there's a expectation of the time horizon that people give for new social programs, in my view, is very, very short. Like, we tend to think, maybe a year, maybe the most we think is in 4-year cycles. We think in kind of the electoral cycle. But in fact, to do this work well, you don't get results in 1 year. You may not even get results in 4 years. And so how do we encourage the media? How do we encourage elected officials and those that authorize this work? How do we encourage them to think long term? I don't have the silver bullet for that, but that's, again, part of the motivation that led us to write these books.
I mean, my own view on the media, for what it's worth, is that the media gets sort of pretty much accustomed to the sort of everyday kinds of failure that we have built into our system, or apparently built in. So we're sort of used to really high levels of recidivism. And what attracts media attention is new types of failure, so a new program that's gone wrong. And I suspect that's where getting sort of hostile reporters on side can be beneficial if you can spend some time explaining to them that actually what we're doing at the moment doesn't really work. And so therefore, running some well-intentioned, well-designed experiments isn't such a bad thing. It can be quite beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is the kind of gotcha journalism that wants to find the errors in any new thing, and I don't know that we're ever going to get past that. And I think particularly now, with the news cycle, it's not, publications aren't weeklies, they aren't monthlies, they're minutes, right? You have to post something every minute. How do you encourage them to actually do, how do you encourage reporters to actually do the homework to figure out what's the proper benchmark against which I should judge this program, right? So a program, an intensive probation program that has a 75% recidivism rate, if you look at that, you might say, well, that is shocking, right? That's failure of the first degree. But compared to what, right? What are we comparing it to? Maybe regular probation is a 90% failure. But I think it's very easy to focus on, the 75% without putting it in proper context.
Just to pull back for a minute, it's quite an exciting moment for you guys in the States at the moment. I mean, one of the things you write about in the book is how
Exciting,
well, it's
scary.
Exciting / scary. How in the 1970s there was more of a culture of academics being involved in criminal justice, and that then got overturned in the 1980s when there was a sort of transfer of criminal justice policy from the executive branch to the legislative branch, and you have 3 strikes and more outlaws, and a vast spike in the prison population in America. But it now seems that partly because of the deficit, the kind of lack of money, America's heading in the opposite direction, or at least heading back a little bit, rolling back some of those things. And this is coming from some quite surprising political quarters.
Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting that there's a lot packed into that question. I mean, I think that when I started in this field more or less many years ago, there was this kind of overhang from this kind of seminal piece of research that happened in the 70s by a sociologist named Robert Martinson, which came to be known as kind of nothing works, right? That it's impossible to change the behavior of offenders, that cities like New York that have a reputation for kind of crime and disorder could never be changed. It's like the weather, you can't affect it. And there was this real kind of sense of despair that I think many in the criminal justice system operated under. And I think that we've done a 180 on that. And I worry in my kind of darkest moments in bed at night that we've gone too far in the other direction. And there's now too much certainty that we know what works, right? And that we need to be more skeptical about some of that. But leaving that aside, I think that this is kind of a moment that's exciting in the United States because you have this enormous budget shortfall at the federal level and at the state and local level that's kind of forcing people to reconsider kind of policies that in my mind haven't worked. And so I think that there's an opening for very significant reform at the moment. But that's kind of, along with that is this concern that, the coffers are empty. And, the reality is any new program that you launch is going to cost money in the short term. You hope that it has benefits on the long term, that it's going to save government in the long term. But almost inevitably, it's going to cost something up front. And so you still have to make the argument to, again, elected officials, city council, the mayor, whoever the power that be is, that you want to invest in something. And so then the third thing you mentioned is that there is this kind of growing movement coming out of unexpected sources in the United States that ideas like linking people to treatment instead of incarceration are a good idea. The right is actually starting to endorse this, and not just the left and the Democratic Party. And so it does feel like we're at a moment of opportunity where, except for the most ideologically extreme people, there's a kind of growing consensus in the field of criminal justice that we need to, spend less on prison, we need to invest in alternatives to incarceration. How that actually plays out remains to be seen.
Just one last question before we throw it open to the questions from the floor. America, lots of states, but very different context to Britain. Some people might say that America has little to teach Britain about criminal justice, given the figures on homicide rates in the states, given the incarceration levels. What would you say to that?
Well, I guess I would say that U.S. If you look at it broadly, you can make that argument, but I think that there are real pockets of excellence in the United States, and I think that the most obvious one is New York, right? I mean, New York homicide rate may still be above London, but basically everything else is below London, right? Robbery rate, burglary rate, forcible rape rate, auto theft rate, all below London. And the New York story is an amazing story when you actually piece it together, because the New York story, I think most people know that crime is down dramatically, 80% from 1990 to now, right? Incredible. I think what is less well known is New York's incarceration rate has gone down by, last I looked, was 27% over that time period. And so New York, counter to this kind of grand narrative in the United States that the reductions we've seen in crime in the US are due to incarcerating and incapacitating people, New York's story runs totally counter to that. And New York's story, in my estimation, and I don't know that, that I have a definitive word on it, New York's story is partially about enormous changes in police practice that, Lord Wasserman could talk about. But New York's story is also about a kind of decision to invest over the course of many decades in an alternative to incarceration programs, like the kinds of things that the Center for Court Innovation runs. Right. And that's the reason why you've seen both this kind of dramatic changes on the street, but also reductions in incarceration. And I do think that that's a model that's worth looking at.
Let's have some questions from the floor. If you could state your name and, if it's appropriate, any sort of affiliation, that would be great. And please keep your questions short, because then we can get lots of them in. Who'd like to start? Let's move.
Juliet Land, Prison Reform Trust.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good, how are you? I think one of the things that interests me now is we've got a coalition government who up front wants to reduce prison numbers and has a number of new ideas about doing it. But given your interest in failure, I'd like you to comment on the plans for payment by results. Because I think there's a lot of scope for improved accountability, but there are some real risks if you set up a way of measuring that makes it very hard to acknowledge failure. But I'd really like your comments on whether you've seen payment by results work, and if so, how can we make it work here?
I am not an expert in payment by results, but I have the concern that you expressed, which is what are the results that we're going to measure? And I have the real concern that they're either going to be set so low that everybody succeeds, right? Or so high that they're impossible to succeed. And the other thing that I would say about that just kind of viscerally, is that there's, again, this kind of, and I understand why, there's this kind of knee-jerk response that the only measure that matters is crime and recidivism reduction. And don't get me wrong, that's the main one, and that's what we should be aiming for, but that's just one thing that we want from the criminal justice system, right? Like, fairness matters. You know, how are we measuring fairness? How are we measuring how the system works together or doesn't work together? So I think that there's lots of results that we should be looking for from the criminal justice system. And I, again, I'm not an expert in payment by results, I'm kind of agnostic about it, but it's something you really have to get right, what the results that you're measuring are, because you know that's where you can get failure.
John Cummins from the Young Offenders Academy Project. I wonder, I heard recently an MP mention the totemic phrase that the money follows what works. It seems to be that in this country, in the criminal justice system, the money very often follows what doesn't work. It continues to go there year after year, and in a sense stifles innovation. I wonder if you could comment on the difference between risk management and risk aversion when it comes to innovation in your field.
Well, I do think, you know, the thing that occurs to me that rings true to me is that it's very, very hard for government sometimes to shut down programs if there's evidence that they're not successful, and that programs develop their own constituency, their own local supporters, and so I think that is a real concern in fact, and it's something that we kind of see over and over again, and the best example of that from our research, again in the States, is looking at the DARE program, which, you know, something like 36 different studies have shown have no impact on substance abuse among the students that participate in them. And so I think some people say, well, just shut them down. And that hasn't happened, in fact. You know, DARE is still pretty widespread in the US. But to DARE's credit, while the program hasn't been shut down, DARE has aggressively had to change their curriculum and change their approach. And so it is not the case that the kind of negative findings have had no impact whatsoever. And so I think as long as that feedback mechanism works, as long as programs are forced to grapple with negative results and change as a result of that, then that's okay. From my perspective, sitting on Mount Olympus, it's okay that DARE continues to exist as long as it's changing and responding to its critics.
I'm Katie Simon Williams from the Prison Reformcast as well. I wanted to ask you, you talked about the fact that the budget deficit and financial situation is creating these opportunities for radical reform, or at least it's bringing in a new view from the right, political right in America. And we're going through a similar situation, of course, here in the UK, where budget deficit seems to be one of the factors that's motivated the coalition government to produce quite a progressive programme in the justice system this year. However, you also pointed out the sort of the flip side to that, which is that there's going to be a big reduction in funding this year, as there is over here, and the fact that innovation needs short-term investment to get those longer-term results. I just wondered if you had any reflections from your own situation in the States on how that's sort of that problem can be addressed, and how you might be looking for other sources of funding or different ways of working.
You know, again, I don't have the magic bullet to that. I mean, that's a very real tension. And I mean, part of why I'm here, part of why we've written these books on failure is to try to introduce a dose of humility and honesty into this conversation. Because I think that I've been in tons of meetings with powerful people that control money, and I can tell you, I don't know how you experience it, but there's an enormous temptation to, lie is too strong a word, but to exaggerate the impacts that you're going to have. And it's a mistake that, you know, I can only speak for myself. It's a mistake that I've seen myself make over and over again, and I don't want to make that over and over again. And so, you know, I think there's got to be a way to, again, educate the media, educate private foundations, educate elected officials about what can realistically be achieved given all of these constraints. And part of the answer, part of the way I answer that, or have answered that in the past, is again back to what I was saying before. there are other things that we should be looking for besides just changes in recidivism. There are tons of other results. What impact does a program have on levels of fear in a community? What impact does a program have on levels of trust in government? And we've been able to marshal data in those regards to help encourage people to invest in our projects, even when we haven't been able to show, look, this has reduced recidivism by 50%, because we're never going to achieve that.
My name is Brian Kingham. I'm a director of Reliance Security. Can I just congratulate Greg on his book? Like so much that comes out of America, it'll be an inspiration to those who are feeling a certain sense of hopelessness about some of the problems we face. But could I just ask you, which is a particularly topical subject, as Juliet's question earlier indicated, what sort of conversations do you have with your funders? As I imagine you're in a very hard-nosed business of trying to raise from perhaps not always wildly enthusiastic funders money to achieve certain results. You must inevitably have to measure those results and give some justification. What's the nature of the conversations there? I mean, you drew attention to the difficulty of black and white in looking at the effect of some of these schemes. And as someone who funded DARE in this country at one stage, I have a certain feeling in the matter. But how did those conversations run? How often are you able to satisfy them conclusively? And how much repeat support do you manage to achieve?
Well, again, I don't mean to repeat myself, but my strategy, to the extent that I have a strategy, and I can be very ad hoc. My strategy is to try to, let me back up. The emphasis that funders have driven over the last generation on results and asking charities and people that run charities to be able to prove their impact, that's mostly a good thing, right? I mean, I think we can all agree that there were, the decades in which you could go and get money from someone just because, you looked nice or because you plucked at a few heartstrings. It's good that those days are gone, and it's good that funders are demanding results. What I try to do is make the case to funders, and again, this is both, I don't really distinguish between private funders and public funders, although there are some distinctions, that we deliver results. I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be able to run an organization that I think is successful if we weren't able to document some positive results, right? So this Red Hook project that we run has transformed this neighborhood that was once one of the most screwed up neighborhoods in Brooklyn. It's now the local precinct is the safest in Brooklyn, right? I can brag about that. We have a program, the Midtown Community Court, that independent evaluators came in and showed reduced local crime by 56%. I can talk about some results. And again, part of my strategy is to broaden the playing field, to insist that there are multiple outcomes we're trying to achieve here. And even though we may not have achieved X, we've achieved Y, Z, A, B, D, and that's part of the way I make the case to funders. But it depends upon the project. But there's no way you can do it unless you can positively assert we've had some positive outputs, right? There's just no way around that anymore, if there ever was.
Hi, Stephen Bediako. I just wanted a couple of questions really. I was really interested in your point around kind of charismatic leaders and the role in how, if you have these guys running projects, they're not sustainable. So I guess I'm just interested in, what's your view on how you get around that? Because my sense is that you usually need these charismatic individuals to get these projects off the ground. So how do you make them sustainable? And I guess the other question I had as well was, I think it's really interesting, this point around being prepared to look at failure. But in the context of the UK, where we're all quite failure averse and we've got the press on our backs, what are some practical hints and tips for introducing this type of work into this UK context?
Well, buy my book. It's a company for all your friends. Exactly. It's a great stocking stuffer. Every night of Hanukkah should be observed by reading my book. I think it's very hard. On the first point, the charismatic leadership point, I think you do need charismatic people to sell ideas. But I think you just have to acknowledge that they disappear at some point and always be thinking about leadership transitions. And I think funders need to be looking underneath the hood of an organization, not just at who their spokesperson is, but like, is there an infrastructure to support this? Am I just buying charismatic person X, or is there actually an infrastructure and architecture that's going to sustain this once charismatic person X leaves? And I think organizations, so that's what funders should be asking, that's what organizations should be asking themselves too. That, you know, it's not just to ride on the coattails of one person. And in terms of changing the culture, in terms of how people view failure, you know, I mean, we're trying to make our small little contribution to that. I think it's by rigorously insisting whenever you meet with funders or when you're, you know, engaged in an association or in conferences, that we reserve some time to acknowledge the reality that, you know, just the way 4 out of every 5 new restaurants in New York City fail, most social programs achieve results that are both positive and negative, and let's be honest about that. And, you know, call The Economist and get them to write about it, call Guardian, you know, encourage people to write about it. Because the media is has the bully pulpit, for better or for worse.
My name is Barbara Khan, and I'm a probation law board, and have been for some years now. And so I've been around some of those sorts of cases here.
Bad things happen.
And I'm sort of interested in the role both of government and the media when those things happen, because if you have a legislative system which allows for parole, you have to have a board to make those decisions, you have to have people to make those decisions. And yet when things do go wrong, the government and the media vilify, and the government separates, stands back and blames. We don't have a learning culture in this country to actually support both the organisations and the people who are charged with making those decisions. And those decisions aren't made lightly, they should be. But it's, you know, some of the rise in the prison population is alleged to be, as a result of parole, becoming more risk-averse and refusing to take those risky decisions. Is that how do you, I suppose, manage yourself as an organisation in order to do your job properly and project an open, decent image to the public to explain what you're doing, but also the government having a role in supporting those organisations who have to carry out the tasks the government sets them to do with an arm's length distance.
It'd be interesting what John had to say about it, but you know, the two things occur to me. One is, you know, build relationships with the media before bad things happen. You know, you don't want the first time you've ever talked to the reporter to be when somebody does something horrendous. And if you have a relation, I can just tell you from my own personal experience, when you have a relationship with a reporter, you have a relationship with a news outlet, they're less likely to want to screw you over. And not that they're not going to write a bad story, but it will be more nuanced. And the second thing is, even as I rail against kind of charismatic leadership, there's no doubt that leadership matters. And I think we need less charismatic leadership and more courageous leadership. And you know, the problem that you just identified of government running away when bad things happen, like that's horrible, right? And we need to get to a culture where, you know, somebody's willing to stand up and say, yes, this is horrible. Yes, you know, if something's broken, we're going to fix it. But this, let us, again, think about this in context. You know, we have 200,000 people or whatever, I don't know what the number is, coming out on parole. This is one incident. Let's remember that framing. And I think that most people get it, as long as you have someone that's willing to step up and be courageous about it. And the problem is that we often don't.
Yes.
I'd like to just pick up on that point. My name is Jessica Grazia, and I have an independent consultancy company which works on criminal justice reform issues. And I've worked in the New York City criminal justice system. I worked for an elected district attorney. I worked over here in the prosecution system over here on various reforms. And one of the things that I noticed, and it's not just in the prosecution entities over here, but throughout, is that there you have the civil service, you have the government, and all the lead agencies here are civil service agencies, and civil servants don't feel in a position that they can say anything which goes against the government, and the whole instinct is to run and hide when something bad happens. And they don't seem to have either a disposition or the power to engage in a direct conversation with the public and with the media about failure. So, for instance, in contrast, the Manhattan District Attorney was elected. I was the first assistant district attorney. I would go out to community groups, I would deal with the media, and we would admit that we would make mistakes. We would say, well, we're prosecuting 100,000 cases a year. We don't get all the cases right. We do make mistakes. We don't want to make those mistakes. We're going to try to do a better job. But we just have to accept failure as part of the world that we live in. Now, you couldn't say that. The agency head couldn't say that over here. And I've never heard an elected official say, there is such a thing as failure. We can't do anything about it. We will fail.
See, one of the interviews in the book was with a friend of mine named Tim Murray, and he likes to talk about what he calls calculated candor. And what you just said, your kind of approach to the community falls into that. And my experience is that you win enormous credit and enormous trust with people at the community level, but I would also argue with the gentleman who asked a question about how I deal with funders. I find that admitting to a certain amount of failure wins me enormous credibility because it buys me buy-in when I start bragging about the Center for Court Innovation, right? Like, oh, he must be telling the truth because he admitted to X failure. And so I think there's a way in which, we miss an opportunity when we don't talk about failure because we could bias goodwill on the other end. And I've seen that happen over and over again. That's great.
Yeah, Philip Gearing, I'm background as a prosecutor and more recently at the Independent Police Complaints Commission. And I guess at the IPCC, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, we deal with failure on a fairly regular basis, failure by the police. And a key part of our culture is exactly what you're saying, is that when things have failed, fess up quickly, put your hands up, because you will gain credit by doing that. And the second thing that people really want to see is people learning from their mistakes, learning from failure. I think though and then embedding that in future practice and improving public service as a result. But I think what we frequently see is when the failure is a failure between sectors, whether it's between police and social services, police and mental health, that things have fallen between the stools. The question is whether you've any particular key messages learning from failure when it's failure between agencies. Getting agencies
to work together. Each agency blames another agency.
No, I have nothing smart to say about that. But I will say that, I think the toughest solving problems like crime, those are incredibly complicated problems, and they don't just impact one agency. It's not just a police problem, it's not just a prison problem or a parole problem. And I think, we need to, and we're finding this over and over again, that in order to make a difference, we need to work, together, not just as a criminal justice system, but with outside social service agencies, with block associations, with other community groups. And sustaining, one of the kind of clear lessons from our work on failure is that sustaining interagency work over the long haul is among the hardest things to do. It's just very, very difficult.
Yes, please. We've got about 5 minutes left, so a few more questions.
I'm Richard Henry, I'm a former police inspector. We've heard a lot tonight about how everybody hates failure, whether it's the police, the government, etc. What do you think the police force's reaction when you have elected police commissioners? Because clearly they're going to hate failure more than anyone does at the moment, because it will be their jobs on the line if we don't deliver. Or like this time.
Do you want an opinion?
No. You're going to blame the prosecutors.
I think that it's going to be hard. I think it's the right question to be asking. Once people have to worry about being elected, that's the calculus of how things play in the media and how things play among the general public is going to be a concern. But I think there's enormous benefits from moving to elected police commissioners too, and I think you have to weigh the minuses with the positives.
There's some examples in the States of elected police commissioners actually being able to be perhaps more courageous than they would have been if they were just appointed, right?
Well, are you meaning elected police chiefs?
Chiefs, yes.
We're talking about elected police commissioners who are not going to be the chiefs, they're going to be as well equivalent to the mayor.
Right.
So it's not quite the same. But there are elected sheriffs, of course. I know what the question was, but I just want to correct.
No,
we're not having elected chief constables.
Sure.
We're not forcing.
Sure, no, absolutely.
I mean, the one thing I will say is in the States, most of the innovation that happens in the criminal justice system starts with police and then kind of infiltrates the other agencies. And that has been the case for the last, 50 years, and I imagine that will be the case going forward too. And so in an odd way, even though it's a paramilitary organization, police are the most innovative of the kind of criminal justice agencies in the States.
I would say that...
Can I just say, are there any more before we go to repeats? Can I just take this?
Yes. Greg, I wanted to follow up on the politicisation point, because I think it's important in the context of commissions. Andrew Bridges is the Chief Inspector of Probation head here. He couldn't be here tonight, and he emailed me about this because it's one concern he's had, and he's given me permission to quote his email. He said, one thing that concerns him is that the government can sponsor, endorse a new initiative and might genuinely wish it to succeed, but if it doesn't, the reality is the minister won't be congratulated for giving it a go. And actually, it will be cascading and failing. And I think the one example he gives here is the drug treatment and testing rules in the last government, which actually weren't ready to be rolled out. And it was as a result of a political agenda which was driving it to roll out. Where do politicians fit in this? Because it's not realistic to expect politicians to encourage innovation, fund it with public money, and encourage it all in private, and then wait 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, perhaps long after they've left the scene, for it to be demonstrated that their pet project worked. They are going to be involved. How do we keep politicians in the right box so they don't wreck the scheme before it fails also?
Am I allowed to pass on these questions? The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is that I think that we have to be wary of and I think I may have fallen prey to it a little bit tonight, of just kind of assuming that politicians are a negative force and, they're going to come down from above with, demanding, to be on TV, they're going to have unrealistic expectations. I think it's very easy to caricature politicians in that way. The truth of the matter is that politicians are very sensitive to what the public wants and needs, and that's a positive thing that they contribute. Lots of the programs that are discussed and profiled in this book would only exist because of the intervention of politicians. So we need politicians. They can be a force for both ill and for good. And how do you discipline politicians, and how do you make sure that you're getting the best of what they bring, their ability to authorize work, their ability to clear kind of institutional hurdles without the negatives? Like, that's a hard question. I don't know that there's an easy answer, but you won't get it unless you're asking that question, and unless you're being thoughtful about how you interrelate with politicians. And I'm with lots of communities of reformers that never think about the politics of what they do. And that's a recipe for failure.
Just had a big bet to its thing. Does that mean we're out of time?
Yep, that's it.
Thank you very much, Greg. And principally, thanks to you. Thanks for coming over from New York to launch the book, and books plural, in fact. I thought it was very interesting. And thanks to Policy Exchange once again. I think there are drinks at the back for anyone who wants to stick around and ask Greg another question, or maybe talk amongst yourselves. Thanks very much.